In this lesson, we'll edit the textures to give better results with the new lighting scheme. Now, at the moment, our lighting scheme is that of a nighttime studio model render with a translucent surface here in the middle that should look something like inflated plastic. Now, one of the things that I think can be improved, I know that there are probably many, but I would like to have a much clearer, more transparent looking material so that I can start seeing some of the detail and the work that we have put into the inside of this building. We'd like to make it almost look like a plastic bubble has been inflated around the entire perimeter of the building. The other thing that we can do after that is just add a little bit more reflection to the steel so that we have something that looks less like paper. Right now this isn't looking glossy enough, and I would like to get some more shininess out of that as well. So let's first tackle the big object, the V-Ray two-sided material. Now essentially the two-sided material is going to give us this paper-like effect. So think again of leaves, think of a paper lantern, and that's exactly what's happening. We've got lighting happening inside, and a good way to see how much lighting is inside is if just you turn off your facade texture, or at least your facade layer, you can see what the render will look like without that material at all. So I'm going to now hit render and just see the result. So here's the render without any facade whatsoever, and we can see that the roof inside is actually quite beautifully lit. There was originally a surface underneath, or in other words a flat editable poly object, and that has now been removed because I think that the building looks a lot better with an exposed truss roof. So I've basically just deleted that ceiling object. So what we want to do right now is to add more transparency to our facade so that we can start to reveal some of the internal goings on within this building. So the material itself is a V-Ray two-sided material, and what you can do already is just to see what it would look like if you only used the inner material within that V-Ray two-sided material. So this one can be called V-Ray or a plastic plane, and that can be a standard V-Ray material. So here we have the same diffuse color, we have reflections, so let's add a little bit more reflections so that it looks more glossy, 0.97, and we're going to give it a quite high refraction so that we almost create a glassy type of material. So I'm just going to see what results I get when we try this material on the facade. So I'm going to bring the facade back in, and I'm going to just select it from my material, or from the layer editor. And I'm going to now apply that plastic plane material. So remember that this is going to look a lot like glass. So let's just see what our results are. So here is our result to that glassy material, and we can see that the results do pretty much look as if the bubbles were completely filled with water or made out of glass. So this is also not really the result that we're trying to get. And we can also notice that the render time has jumped up substantially because the entire space frame ceiling is now being refracted, and all of those lines are now being bent through these complicated forms. So a few things that we can do at this point. I'm first of all going to isolate out my facade, and one of the little tricks here that I'd like to do is just to reduce the complexity of what's being rendered by hiding the inner layer of this material. That means I'm only going to be rendering through the outer layer, which is going to still give me the look that I'm wanting, but it's not going to give me the complexity of having so much geometry. So I've just gone and right clicked and hidden all of that unnecessary geometry, and the next thing I'm going to do is just make a few adjustments to this plastic. Now, one of the big differences between glass and plastic would be the IOR value. Plastic is a lot less dense than glass, so typically plastic would have a value of around 1.46. So we can also test this out, and we can just see now what result we get. Just before I do render out, I'm also going to make sure that we have slightly less reflections. So the refractions are almost at the maximum, and the reflections are just going to be ever so slightly less. And I'm also going to make it slightly less glossy, so it's going to be a little bit more matte. I'm going to go back into my camera view, which is camera 3, and I'm going to do another test render. So here's the result to that render. We can see that it is looking less complicated, and we have almost halved our render time. So we're, instead of about 2.5 minutes, we're 1.5. So we're basically doing quite well on that. To remove the refractions even more, I'm going to drop the density of this material even lower, so just below the value of plastic even. I'm going to try a value of 1.2 to really push that IOR way down, even below the actual real-world scale. And I'm going to do another test render, but this time I'm just going to do a test render on a small region, and I'm going to speed up my workflow by not re-rendering the entire frame. So here I have a result, and I've done one or two more tweaks along the way as well, and I'm going to show you now exactly what has been done. So I've been continually reducing my IOR value until I've stopped getting such heavy refractions within this, because I didn't want to have this solid glass looking object. This is more or less the result I've been trying to achieve, where I still see some of the structure coming through, but all the lines are not getting completely destroyed. Then the refraction value I've very slowly and incrementally been reducing so that we have less and less refraction. Perhaps we can go slightly back and go more or less to the middle mark. The reflections as well have been increasing slightly, because the more reflections we get, the more of that night sky we get reflecting in these little bubbled areas. So the result is more or less correct. It looks a little bit like plastic. The main thing to remember is that plastic will not give you as much refraction as a solid bubble of glass or water. So we can now look at the entire building being rendered if we're happy with that material, and we can then continue on with the next lesson once we're done with that. So just before I finish, let's have a look at what the full building looks like with that material on. So here is our final result for that facade texture, and I do quite like the way that the inside is revealed but yet slightly veiled. So we're getting some of the insides coming through, and I can just imagine that if there was an expo happening with lights, you'd be able to see all that activity, but it wouldn't look as though it was just plain glass, which would be a little bit too boring for such a huge scaled box. So the last thing just before I finish the lesson is I wanted to add a bit more glossiness to the framed texture. And remember, in the beginning when we made it, it was a darker reddish gray, and I basically brought it back to white because I wanted to keep the model as abstract looking as possible. I didn't want to go too realistic with all the materials, especially since we already have this facade texture looking so realistic. So to create glossier reflections, let's just increase this reflective glossiness layer or level to 0.98, and I'm also going to increase the amount of reflections that we're getting on the outside to about 100. Then I'm going to increase the reflections on the front to a value of about 20. So once we render that out, we should have a little bit more of a shiny metal to that. And I think it's going to give a better looking result as well. So that is it for this lesson. We've basically looked mainly at this facade texture, which is quite a complicated one to work on. You do need to do a lot of regions, and again, the same thing that applies to speed modeling is don't over render things that you don't need. Just do a small region of what you do need and try to keep your object as simple as possible. So the decision of actually removing that inner layer means that the building is less realistic because that bubble is now only one-sided, but it's going to create a faster and easier render, and that as well, if it speeds up your workflow, then it's a good decision. So that's it for this lesson. We're going to look in the next lesson at just how to populate this entire model with little conceptual figures that can give a sense of scale to our entire building. So often that is quite a nice way to show how much space can be occupied by how many people, and that's going to give us a final touch to this model before we go and do a few renders and final views before we finish up the course.